evening, ladies and gentlemen. Rodger, we talked about the importance of strategic philanthropy. We talked about the importance of collaboration between government, the social sector, and of course, what we're seeing happen with various examples on the philanthropic side. I want to pick up on the point that was raised there by Nachiket Moore, that, you know, because it's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, it's probably easier for you to be able to collaborate with governments as well as the private sector. So the aspect of private philanthropy and the importance that that can play as a third pillar, you've got the government, you've got the markets, as the third pillar, how crucial is that and what's the experience been?
So thanks very much, and it's been great to be here, and Dr. Khan, thanks for the words that you gave us. You know, at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we really believe that all lives have equal value, but unfortunately, not everyone has equal access or equal opportunity. And one of the areas that I oversee is our agricultural work, and where I think about those three pillars and they intersect, we do a lot of very, very early upstream discovery work that is really not capable for governments to do, in the sense that it's very risky, it's very binary, it could be huge failures, and they have an accountability for their money that would be just too risky for them to take.
Yeah.
Secondly, for private sector, they have an opportunity or an obligation to their shareholders,
right,
that the cycle time between the discovery and the product they would sell could be a decade or 2 decades. And where philanthropy comes in, it says, look, the world needs the right kind of disease protection for neglected crops in Africa or in the tropics that are not going to be funded by the private sector. We can do that early work in things like nitrogen fixation and other things. We can hand that off to products in the private sector when they're ready, and government can prioritize those products and services for low-income people in a way that's affordable, that's reliable, and that's adapted to the local conditions. And I think we've seen that happen around the world. I think we're seeing that in India, and it's raising productivity and it's raising incomes.
Okay, so that's as far as the risk capital aspect of philanthropy is concerned. Ashish, let me come to you now. And you know, we've got the CSR law that's been mandated. You know, corporates do need to spend 2% of their profits towards corporate social responsibility every year. Do you believe that that has in fact taken the pressure off of individual philanthropy, or do you believe that that is in fact building the momentum for individuals to also participate and give more?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think in some cases people feel, particularly if it's a promoter-driven company, that they don't see the difference.
Yeah.
They feel that I'm doing my duty by giving away 2% through CSR. But by and large, I've seen private philanthropic capital grow very rapidly in this phase as well. Because there are a number of other people who look at it to say, I can get immense leverage on my capital as well. If I can come in early, take the highest risk, actually there's a lot of money, you know, that can come behind that allow for these projects to be scaled up over time. So I've seen it at Central Square Foundation. We've probably funded 25, 30 nonprofits at an early stage, and in many of them we've had, you know, HDFC and Deutsche Bank and others contribute meaningful checks. So it's been a great way for us to take the risk early on, try out crazy stuff. Some of those things have failed. And then bring in CSR capital as the B round, C round capital, as it were, to come in thereafter. Okay,
Vidya, just to take the CSR conversation forward, I mean, you know, this is a new pool of capital and it's a significant pool of capital. Are you seeing it being used effectively? What's the experience been like?
I think in the early days there was you know, a lot of apprehension about you know, how do you really manage this? Most corporates did not have staff dedicated to this, and we found that people in HR or in corporate communications were double hatting. But I think over the last 2 years there's been you know, the learning curve has been very, very sharp. At EdelGive, for example, we work with several corporations, foundations, as well as high net worths. And our experience has been, like Ashish mentioned, if you create great collaborative pools of capital in a structured way, you're in a sense coming in early, removing the risk, actually also underwriting part of the risk by saying that my capital will come in first. And then corporates find it much easier because you've taken out the risk. You've also introduced elements of measurement which are very important to corporates. So I think to that extent, I think the learning curve has been incredibly sharp. As long as projects are structured in a way that enable them to do their compliance well, I think they're willing to now.
Is that the biggest deterrent? You know, the lack of structure, the lack of transparency, you know, compliance-related risk, is that the big deterrent today?
I think it's not so much as a deterrent, it's more that because there are very few corporations with large CSR staff, the easier you package it in a sense that makes the project very clear, makes the measurement very clear, and therefore the compliance easy. I think the moment the packaging is right, the capital starts coming in.
Okay, you know, and I want to come back to you, Rodger. What will it take? Because we heard from Mr. Kant here that the government can play facilitator, and in a lot of these areas, whether it's healthcare or education, it can even provide capital, which the government effectively does. But when it comes to delivery, it's perhaps best that the private sector is involved. But when we talk about the role of the government, in your experience with the Gates Foundation, what is it that you would like to see being done differently, especially when we talk about collaboration in terms of delivery?
I have to say that in the case of India, we've had an incredible relationship, both at the state level and at the federal level, of cooperation. So nothing comes to mind where it says, I want government to do something differently. I think government sees its obligations to its citizenry in a way that says we need to provide healthcare, we need to get livelihoods going, we need to understand social and economic mobility. Yeah. But oftentimes governments are really constrained by the information they have access to because they're so deeply ingrained in what's going on in their own context that may not actually understand all the peer learning happening around the world. And that's where philanthropy for us has been a really great partnership. So one thing that we've recently done with the state of Bihar is work on the livestock master plan. And that's where we were able to align with what the Bihar government wanted to achieve in its master plan, and then we were able to take examples from around the world where that productivity has come, and then deliver that they can actually connect with the technical assistance they've needed. And the great thing about India is not only have we been able to do that from a connecting point of view into India, but now India's experience, like with payment banks and other kinds of financial inclusion, we've actually brought other countries into India to learn from that experience. And it's really that connective role that I think philanthropy can play in a more easy, flexible way that's harder to do for governments where there are all the diplomatic channels and all the regulations around that.
Right. Ashish, you know, the identification of what needs to be done by way of addressing problems in India, I mean, that's clear, you know, whether it's healthcare, it's education, it's financial inclusion and all of that. The question though is, how do you appropriately address them? How do you build scale around the delivery of some of the solutions that we've just talked about? What's the best way forward in being able to use philanthropic pools of capital to ensure that?
Yeah, I think Nachiket and Dr. Kant touched on some of it, but one is, I think the R&D work needs to be done by philanthropy. Government is not a risk taker, it's a behemoth. And so when you operate at that scale, you really can't try innovative programs. Take something like education technology. I think the private sector will lead. Foundation's role is to help shape supply and build the evidence and do some demonstrations at the state level to convince government. Governments were extremely willing to pay for the hardware. So there's lots of money. There's real interest from chief ministers as well. They sometimes don't know what to do early on. And we can pay for third-party measurement and evaluation, a bunch of other softer stuff, project management, things like that. So there's a great opportunity with limited resources available from philanthropy and that risk-taking ability to catapult a government program going forward.
What do you see as the big challenges in order for us to sort of be able to achieve that objective? Do you think there continues to be an issue of trust that holds back both the private sector as well as the government from being able to collaborate in a meaningful way?
No, I think we were more clear. I think NITI has done this to a great extent with the aspirational districts. If states were to be clear saying, look, we understand what you're saying, let's work in a structured way in one district and we sign a clear MOU saying if you achieve these metrics, we'll make this available and we'll scale it at this pace going forward. I think the challenge we sometimes see with state governments is they want to go too fast. Whereas we're saying, let's work at the level of one district first and then take it from there. Or sometimes they're trying to boil the ocean. they're trying to do too many things versus saying,
Yes.
you know, these are the 2 or 3 highest priority things,
Yeah.
and let me focus on this and just make this happen versus trying to do everything.
Yeah,
all at once.
I think that is a real problem. Vidya, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, you know, we, for example, have a collaborative in Maharashtra with the government of Maharashtra in education. And it's been a very interesting journey over the last 3 or 4 years. And I think for us, the initial dialogue was the one that took the longest. Just establishing the rules of the game, the framework in which we would work together with the government. I think that took almost 15 to 18 months. And once that happened, it was much easier to go out into the districts and actually execute the program. I think the government's biggest challenge has been that, you know, there are structural issues in education. And philanthropy can, to some extent, really solve the delivery. By being innovative in teacher training, for example, or leadership building and things like that. But ultimately, philanthropy also needs to start working with government on making structural change. So, for example,
Are you seeing that happen?
And I think that openness is now coming in because the government budgets do not allow for any innovation in structural reform. When 97% of your budget goes to teacher salaries, there's nothing really left for you to do, you know, innovatively. So how does philanthropy come in and say, if we need system level change, and what does it mean? You know, a lot of it is really building the capacity of government to deliver education the way it needs to. And private philanthropy can do that. I think that openness is there. And the other thing, and partly maybe because of what Niti Aayog did, partly because of the pressure on states to really, I think every state now needs to present a report card on learning outcomes. Partly what Asar did was really forced governments to say, what is my report card on learning outcomes? And I think that shift is now, you know, if Rajasthan can do it, why can't Karnataka do it? And that sense of competition among states is also making our life in philanthropy a little bit easier when it comes to working with governments.
You know, one of the other issues and challenges I think that corporations have faced, especially when we talk about the absorptive capacity of absorbing the CSR funding that's come in, is how do you work with the social sector effectively? You know, how do you actually build capacity even within the social sector to be able to deliver on the outcomes that Vidya just spoke of? What's been the experience as far as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is concerned on that particular issue?
Look, I think it's an excellent question, and it's one that we've wrestled with in philanthropy, and I'd love to hear what the other panelists, if their experience is. I think that one of the challenges philanthropy has faced is that we sometimes don't know what we want the private sector to do. So we have this kind of idea that the private sector needs to come alongside of us, but we are not able to come and say, okay, what we really need the private sector to do is deliver this piece of the puzzle. And what we have found at the Gates Foundation is where we get clear on the role of the private sector, where we get clear on the role of government, and we get clear on what our unique role may be, then you have something that's catalytic. One of the examples we worked on is in the Global Fund, which was founded in 2002 for AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Really, that is where there's new vaccine development, there's price subsidy, there's distribution and frontline workers, and that combination has probably saved 27 million lives since that period. And that's where we got clear on those different roles. So sometimes we blame the private sector for like, why don't they do this? But they're not clear of their role, especially when it's a new area like CSR.
Is there clarity on the purpose and the role as far as the private sector is concerned? And what is it, you know, when you go about making an investment, what is it that you weigh today as you do that?
Yeah, so I think even in the social sector, frankly, a lot of it depends on the people. I mean, it's the entrepreneur who is driving the nonprofit and their team, clearly the vision, clearly some evidence that the problem they're working on, the area is important. There's evidence globally or within India or even their program. Sometimes we're willing to support even before the program shows results. And that they're effective in terms of using the rupee and stretching it, and they know how to work with government, because if you want pathways to scale, you will have to work with government. So there's a few criteria, I think, that most people look at. I think on the CSR front, I don't think there's an there was initially some absorptive capacity issue, but the money is getting spent now. I think it's what Vidya said, which is that a lot of corporates sometimes put their communications or PR people into CSR.
Yeah.
They don't build a proper team. I think if they make that small investment, obviously a small company can't do that. But if you have a 30 crore or 50 crore budget, you ought to staff the team appropriately, and it should be okay to spend 5% of your budget on internal resources to deliver more effective results.
Are corporates spending the money that we have as far as the CSR budgets are concerned as effectively as they ought to, and even as much as they ought to?
I think if you look at the data, it's very mixed. I think the top companies, the top 50, 60 companies are sort of struggling actually to meet their budgets. It's the smaller companies with budgets in the range of 3 to say 10 crores.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Who sort of end up doing it. And again, for the large companies, I think there is still a little bit of an absorptive capacity issue in the NGO world, because there aren't too many scaled NGOs in the country. It's just a handful. And most of those scaled NGOs are also incidentally have been set up by people from the corporate world, so who understand scale. So I think the issue is, how do we, even as philanthropy, work with NGOs in a way that, support programs at the design stage, where can they be designed for scale? And similarly, how can you work with founders who have a scale mindset as well? And I think that's where the absorptive capacity is going to be built. Because otherwise, if you have, say, for example, a Reliance has a 700 crore budget, I mean, it's just going to be spray and pray, right? They're just going to find maybe 150 NGOs to give a little bit to, or support large programs that are very aligned to their business. And then you can't fault them for it.
No, you can't. But I think that is a concern. But let me bring in the audience here. If anybody has a question here for Rodger, Ashish, or Vidya, if you could raise your hands, we'll get the microphone across to you. Anyone here with a question or perhaps even a comment on the discussion so far?
As philanthropists, should government not spend its money? Is philanthropy to subsidize government, or is it to create the innovations? Ashish, you do, and you do, and many other philanthropists, international, like the Gates does. So I'd love for you to spell out what you really think should be the role of philanthropy, and especially in the context of subsidizing government. I see more and more of that.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a great question. Rodger, you want to start with that, and then I'll get Ashish and Vidya to jump in.
I think our Indian friends should start.
Okay, all right, okay. Indian friends, Ashish, you want to start with that?
I don't know enough about the aspirational districts program to comment.
No, but on the larger issue.
But I think on the larger issue,
are you replacing government funding, or are you, in addition to, are you providing the risk capital for the innovation, for the big bold bets, or are you basically subsidizing government programs?
a little bit of both happens. I think there is, of course, a lot of traditional philanthropy where people will pay for hardware, which frankly government should be paying for, or if it's computers in schools, frankly government should be paying for that. So I agree with you on that. But I think more and more the needle is turning more in the direction of people saying, we want to pay for technical support, we want to pay for things that are new. So for instance, the software, and eventually a budget will get created for that. I think the needle is turning in that direction. Or I want to pay for measurement and evaluation. I think those things are appropriate for third parties to sort of pay for. But if it's going to substitute what government is already supposed to be doing, I think it's inappropriate.
Vidya?
Yeah, I would agree with Ashish. I think even from what I've seen, like I said, when large parts of the budget go into just running the program for, say, the government of Maharashtra, then can philanthropy come and improve system capacity, make it more efficient? Can the delivery of government funding or government budgets become more efficient? Making that itself, I think, and the government has no money to make itself more efficient. So can philanthropy come and play that role? And a lot of it means actually working with various system levels, and they're very complex, as you are aware. District, block, cluster, how do you build capacity of officials at different levels? A lot of it is actually what you do in the private sector all the time, which is build people capability. We know that, we understand that. And I think that is something that the private sector can very beautifully bring in.
Okay, Rodger, I'll give you the final word on this. You know, as we talk about building up this ecosystem to encourage more people to consider strategic philanthropy, just lessons of the experience operating in other emerging markets, developing markets, the do's and the don'ts that you would leave us with.
So I think we've seen in the last few years a pretty substantial growth in India in philanthropic giving from something around 6 billion to 10 billion. And as we just heard, I think things like the Giving Pledge are a real catalyst for that, because it challenges givers not just on the amount they give, but how they give and what's strategic. And there are several members in India who are part of that, who've made these commitments and have stepped up their own giving, but also actually really thought about how they give. I think some of the transparency on who you're giving to takes away some of the fear that something's happening of influence that we don't know. In the States, we have the 990, which shows exactly who's getting the money. I don't know what the right solution is in India, but I do think that the transparency is key. And then I think the other thing is that oftentimes philanthropists historically have given in silence or given quietly behind the scenes. And I think that doesn't allow others to crowd in or, as we heard earlier, to push an agenda forward that actually benefits everybody. And so I think that's the other trend that it would be great to see, is philanthropists not trying to take credit, but being public around what they're concerned about, because many of the philanthropists I know feel they benefited hugely from the area they grew up in, from the community in which they are engaged, and they're trying to create that opportunity for others. And doing that in a way that's transparent, that's open, that's clear. I think we've seen that be more catalytic, and we've seen it bring others in to do the kinds of things that we've just heard on the panel today. So actually it feels like it's moving in the right direction.
Well, we are certainly moving in the right direction. Hopefully there will be much more convergence, collaboration and thoughtfulness, not just on how we're spending our money, but also where we're putting that money and the best use for it. Thank you very much for joining us here, Rodger, Ashish and Vidya. Thanks very much for your time. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.